Today we're going to be doing a reading and discussion with our four writers here. L.J. Martin is the author of over 55 fiction and nonfiction books, including 2,000 Grueling Miles. Sharma Shields is the author of a short story collection, Favorite Monster, and two novels, The Sasquatch Hunter's Almanac and The Cassandra. Eric Scott Fischl is the author of speculative historical novels, Dr. Potter's Medicine Show and The Trials of Solomon Parker, and In Memory of the Girl in Green. And then Sherry Jones is the author of 6 historical fiction books, including Josephine Baker's Last Dance. And you guys want to get started with the reading?
Sure. I'll start on this end and go that way.
Yeah.
Go for it. That sound good? All right. So I'm going to read from my novel, The Cassandra. This just came out in February of this year. Should I use the mic or can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I started writing this book in 2014, right before my first novel came out. I had been envisioning writing a Northwest version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm from Spokane. I write a lot about the inland Northwest. I got my MFA here at the University of Montana. And I was researching locations for where to settle this book. And around that time, I got diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And someone said to me, well, we have a really high incidence of MS in this region because we're downwind of Hanford. So my first thought was not, wow, now I understand why I have MS, but, oh, now I know where to set this crazy mad scientist novel I want to write. And so I booked a tour of the Hanford facility. It's now a national monument, and you can go there and take a bus around the Hanford Reach. The tours are extremely popular, so I booked the tour in April. I went there in August of 2015, and I got to tour the B reactor and the Hanford Reach while I was there. And I hadn't thought about making it a historical novel until I did that tour. And then I realized there were so many parallels between our current era and what was happening in 1944 and 1945 with the Manhattan Project. And kind of, I started thinking about women entering the workplace there. I thought a lot about the secrecy of the project, how people working at Hanford had no idea that they were creating the plutonium for the bomb that was dropped specifically on Nagasaki in Japan. And that this all happened in pretty much my backyard in the inland Northwest, and that I had never really learned anything about it until I was starting to research on my own. So I started envisioning a woman from Central Washington who goes to work at Hanford and starts out the novel very naive and sort of starstruck with the idea of patriotism, of helping her country, and ends up really having to face a lot of toxic masculinity there, and a lot of violence that she is both a victim to and complicit in as well. And of course that made me think of the Cassandra myth. And in the Cassandra myth, Apollo tries to woo her by giving her the gift of foresight. And when she refuses him, he curses her so that she'll never be believed, even though she's seeing the future unfold. So that is the dark tale of the Cassandra. I'm just going to read a short section of it, and then I'll let other people read. And thank you, everybody, at the Montana Book Festival, the volunteers, all my writers I get to read here with today. I love the Montana Book Festival. I've been coming to this for years, and I'm just so happy to be a part of it again. So this is from the first chapter, set in 1944, To Make Men Free. I was at the mercy of the man behind the desk. I needed him to see my future as clearly as I saw it. He held 4 pink digits aloft, ring finger belted by a fat gold band, and listed off the qualities of the ideal working woman: chaste, willing, smart, silent. I swallowed his words, coaxed them into my bloodstream, my bones. I crossed my ankles and pinned my knees together, morphing into the exemplary she. The man eyed me with prideful ownership. Frankly, Miss Groves, you're the finest typist we've interviewed. Your speed and efficiency are commendable. I opened up my shoulders, smiling. They named me star pupil at OMAC Secretarial. You're not a bad-looking girl, you know that? Thank you, how kind of you. A little large, plumper than some, but a nice enough face. The man smoothed open the file on his desk. Good husband stock at Hanford, Miss Groves. Plenty of men to choose from. In my lap, my hands shook like tender newborn mice. Such sweet, dumb hands. Calm down, you wild darlings. I focused on the man's sunburnt face. It reminded me of a worm's face, sleek, thin-lipped, blunt. He was handsome in a wormish way, or wormish in a handsome way. If I squinted just a little, his head melted into a pink oval smudge. Okay, and I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. She does get the job at Hanford, and she goes to work there as a secretary to one of the lead physicists there, whose name is Dr. Hall. And she's starting to settle in nicely, but some disturbing things are starting to happen. And one of those is that Mildred is, like Cassandra in mythology, clairvoyant, and she's starting to have visions while she's at Hanford. And so I'm going to read one of those now. Just the beginning of one, if I can find it, sorry. This is from a chapter called Skulls. Later, an hour, several hours, the vision prodded me awake and urged me to rise. The same swampy, heady sensation fell over me, the one I always had during a vision, the sound of invisible wings in my ears. The weight of it took hold of me by the armpits and pulled me outdoors. I floated obediently east through the dimmest shadows of the sleeping barracks. I traveled the short distance to the western bank of the Columbia River, where the water whirled along the northeastern corner of the Hanford camp. Over the river and through the woods, but there were no woods here, and my consciousness blinked in and out. I stumbled forward lazily, drunkenly. The wings shuddered and the pressure around my chest released. A great blue heron materialized on the step, huge, nearly 5 feet tall, her thick throat like a rope, her shoulders hunched, her legs two pale orange stalks with high ankles like contorted knees. She stared at me ferociously with a round yellow eye, and then squawked, trembling, and collapsed into another creature, a pocket mouse. The mouse raced forward and sniffed anxiously at my slippered feet. Then it stretched accordion-like, squeaking and hissing, now a rattlesnake, firm and sleek in brown and ivory scales. Aufhacker, my German grandmother would have said, shapeshifter. The snake rattled its tail, but I felt no fear. My visions made me impenetrable. I'm going to skip down just a little bit here. The wind nodded in her dark shawl of glittering stars, crouched with her strong thighs all around us. A few yards away lay the disembodied head of a mule deer buck. His purple tongue hung from his mouth, the heavy antlers and neck mottled with blood. Killed by coyotes, no doubt, or perhaps by a lone mountain lion. When I turned, there was the heron, grooming her feathers with the whetted orange spear of her beak. I hunkered on a precipice overlooking the Columbia. The water coursed indifferently toward the ocean, gripped in its basin by the rocky fist of cliffs on the eastern side. The heron's black plumes stirred in the wind. I turned to her, waiting. Her beak remained closed, but she spoke to me as loud as a branch breaking. Watch the river. I watched. The water drained away, so slowly at first I wondered if I was imagining it, but then, yes, certainly, the water was leaving for good, as though the basin were no more than a long serpentine bathtub from which an invisible hand had pulled the plug. The shoulders of rocks appeared like dark scabs, thousands of them, and I fought the urge to run down the side of the basin and dance across them. The heron lifted her speckled throat, and the long feathers on her neck jutted like thorns. Then she cowered and in a deft movement lifted away from the hill's summit, beating her large wings ponderously, swooping toward the desolate river basin. I beetled down the hillside after her, recalling how, when I was a girl, I would plunge down the bouldered embankment into the aching cold of the Okanagan River. On the rocky beach, the heron waited for me. She pointed her beak toward the belly of the riverbed. I ambled atop the black rocks, skipping from one to another, but they shifted beneath my feet. I slipped again and again, trying to gain purchase and failing. I wasn't annoyed. It was a game, no more, a fun game to play atop the rocks, and when I tripped into the small puddles of water, all that remained of the Columbia, I laughed and splashed. I put my hand against a round stone and was surprised to find it wet, not with water, but with something soft and fleshy, algae, I assumed, moss. I drew the substance away like it were the top of a mushroom, and it came off easily in my palm with a little pop. The smell was both terrible and good, a burning like over-roasted meat. I turned the thing over in my hand and stared for a moment, disbelieving, before dropping it at my feet. It was the skin of a child's face. The black stone was no stone, but a skull, grinning at me fiendishly. I examined the other stones, the ones I'd danced across so clumsily and merrily, and they too were skulls, and beneath them, trapped in the mud of the riverbed, were the bodies. People of all ages, small children, others stooped and aged. A high-pitched whining started up in my left ear, the tinnitus I suffered during a vision, or if I grew too exhausted. I found a woman with her breasts blackened and burned, pockets of flesh half melted. Around her, some of the skulls' mouths screamed. Others were pinned tight, addressing their end calmly, as though struck dumb by its arrival. "Who are they?" I cried. "What's happened to them?" The wind whipped at me, scolding me, and some of the skulls crumbled into dust beneath her words. When I turned, there was the heron, picking awkwardly at the bones with her nightmarish toes. She lifted her head and gazed at me with the gold death coin of her eye. Eventually, we must become who we are. I'll stop there.
I guess we're going in order. I didn't know we were reading, but I think still. This book is set around the Deer Lodge prison. I think it'd be fairly self-explanatory. I'm going to read you just a couple of paragraphs out of the first of a couple of books here. Rural again. Oats or some damn thing, cooked with too much water. Now a gray slop, and a fist-sized chunk of hard bread that's so damn wiggly with weevils it looks alive when it's just sitting on the hard, cold stone floor. I wonder, are weevils good as meat? That's breakfast, and with luck, lunch is beans that Cookie waves some bacon over, and in a tin plate with only 15 minutes to lean your pick and shovel aside so as to suck it down. Thanks be to the good Lord, I have a plan to put miles between me and Deer Lodge prison. I figure 7 years of a life sentence is enough for any man, and I've sure as hell become a man since they wrongly threw me in this hole only 4 months after I'd reached my majority of 2 years less than a score. And in this prison, thanks be to who I thought was a friend, one who actually did the dirty deed I am in prison for, and his mine-owning rich son of a she-dog daddy, who owns not only a producing gold mine, but also the judge and most of the jury. This one's set around the Oregon Trail. I actually wrote this book because I was having some grandsons myself. I was a little concerned about how easy they have it these days, and how they didn't know how tough it was for the folks that crossed the country and built this country. "You're a stinky toad," my little sister Willie yells at me. She's mad, as I said, she couldn't take the old rocking crib that once held me and my sisters and now is home to her rag dolls. I truly hope no one will have need of a crib in the months to come. The Oregon Trail is likely no place for a newborn, or for Ma having to care for one. "And you're a skinny tadpole." "You're a slimy tadpole," I replied, and she sticks her tongue out at me, which makes me laugh and her stomp away. "What did you say to her?" my older sister Edna May yells from her perch, stowing things in the wagon that's to be our home for some time. "I told her she was pretty as a cornflower," I say, and laugh again. Horse feathers, Edna May yells back, but goes back to her chore. My pa, Tobias Zane, strides up from working on the wagon's front axle, which will receive the tongue, and says that in that gravelly voice of his, "Here, Jake, prove your worth." He hands me and adds and challenges me with a hand on my shoulder and those cold gray eyes praising me. This one's based on and actually the most historical book I've written. It's a historical novel. I tried to get the publisher, when this was published a long time ago, to publish it as a biographical novel, which there was no genre as a biographical novel at the time, and they wouldn't do it. I argued with them a little bit, but now I'm able to do it myself. The beauty of Amazon and the opportunities we have these days. Prologue, summer 1828. The nation's capital bustled with activity. A tall, whipcord lean man with a shock of gray hair flaring from under his black high hat dodged a gig pulled by a red-roan horse. He waited for a beer wagon, clattering and bouncing behind a team of match grays, then strode across Pennsylvania Avenue near the White House. His gold-candled cane tapped the brick street with a jaunty manner, and as he enjoyed the warmth and pleasant breeze of the summer's day. Then he stiffened and rose to his full height, his prominent chin thrusting forward in a determined set, when he noticed two boys in a rough-and-tumble scrap in the gutter. In 4 quick steps, he was within reach and rapped the nearest boy with a stiff one across the shoulders. Both boys, scuffed and puffing, stopped, their fists balled at their sides to glare at the intruder. "Here, here, you boys, save that energy for the schoolroom, where it'll bring you more than a useless black eye." The boys glared at each other for a moment more, each thinking a black eye on his opponent would not be so useless. Then the taller of the two, who had received a stout rap of the cane, broke and ran down the street. "What caused such a ruckus, young man?" the gentleman asked reproachfully, then crouched to kneel eye to eye with the smaller boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "He called Andy by God Jackson a name, sir." The gray-haired man bristled, then his blue eyes glinted and with mischief under bushy gray brows, and looked down his long nose. But he didn't smile. "And what name was that?" A jackass, sir." This brought a half smile that softened the angular features. I could go on and on, but this book is based very closely on the journals of Edward Fitzgerald Beale, who had 9 feet of journals in our national archives, and was probably the most unsung hero out of the West. The guy crossed the country 13 times on horseback, was a hero of the Battle of San Pasquale, probably maybe was responsible more than anybody singularly for winning the Civil War for the North, because he convinced Lincoln not to impose the draft on California. California was the only state in the Union that didn't have the draft imposed. California was very heavily in the South. 3,000 soldiers enlisted from Los Angeles in the Confederacy. 6 enlisted in the Union. That must mean move it on.
Well, I just want to say before I read that I am just so honored to be here. I mean, L.J. Martin has written 55 books. Wow, I can imagine how prolific.
My wife's written 75.
Oh my gosh.
I'm a
And Eric is
writer.
writing his speculative historical fiction, which I think is just such a fascinating genre, where you look back and imagine what might have been, right? And Sharma Shields and I both live in Spokane. I actually lived in Missoula until 2007 and used to write for the Missoulian, so you might remember my byline. But Sharma's book, The Cassandra, I can't recommend it highly enough. I read it. It was a powerful, powerful book. I mean, how can you go wrong with writing like, I looked at my hands in my lap, trembling like tender newborn mice.
Yeah.
Wow, what great writing. So, and it's really such a powerful book. I just really recommend it. So My newest novel is called Josephine Baker's Last Dance, and it's biographical fiction about the life of the famous early 20th century African-American performer Josephine Baker. She was very famous in Paris. You might remember her from, she wore the famous banana skirt and very little else on stage. So she was, she became famous at age 19. She was very young. It was her first trip ever out of the United States. She was astonished by by the equal treatment of people of color by predominantly white Paris or France. And so the book is really a lot about race because even though I'm a white person, I found it very illuminating and enlightening for me to write about how Josephine Baker was treated throughout her life in various situations. And also she was an inspiring person. People think of her as this woman in the banana skirt, but she was really so much more than that. Yes, she was a nude performer. She was exploited by the producers of the show that she had gone to Paris to perform in. But once she got the reaction from the crowd, she quickly embraced the idea of being, the famous black nude dancer in France. But as soon as she could, she remade herself. And she became this very famous, elegant chanteuse, wearing the big feathered hats and the long gowns and all the beads. And she was very, very popular. But then during World War II, when the Nazis invaded Paris, Josephine Baker went underground, and she worked as a spy with the French resistance and risked her life many times to carry information written in invisible ink on her sheet music, and also notes pinned to her underwear, and also written on the insides of her arms but wearing long sleeves, to get information across the borders to the Charles de Gaulle and the French resistance fighters in London. So then after that happened, she came back to the United States for her third U.S. tour, and she had been so upset at how she had been treated on previous trips to the United States that she refused to perform. This is in 1951. She held a press conference and announced that she would not perform in any club or theater or any venue that was segregated, and nor would she dine in segregated restaurants, and she wouldn't stay in any town. She canceled her Atlanta, Georgia appearances because she couldn't find a hotel that would let her stay. And there were white hotels. Everything was segregated. And so she was like the first person to really use her fame, her platform, to draw attention to the discrimination, the racism that segregation imposed on people of color. So I'm just going to read you a couple of passages. One is, I'm going to read to you from the first passage from the first time that she performed on stage in Paris, her very first show. She danced with the name of the show was called La Revue Negre. It was the first African-American revue, sort of a vaudeville style show. This was in 1925. And she danced with a man named Joe Alex, who was the producers of the show, the theater managers, had brought him in because he was a very dark-skinned Nigerian. And unlike in the United States, where the only way you could be a black performer is if you had very light skin, in France they wanted their black performers as black as possible. They saw that as very exotic, and there was a whole African craze happening at that time in Paris. So Joe Alex, and then Maud is Maud de Forest, who was the lead singer in La Revue Negre. Josephine wanted to be the singer, and so she hated Maud de Forest. She was very jealous. Maud also had a big drinking problem, so that's sort of mentioned in here. And Mrs. Caroline was the woman who actually, the white woman who got the whole troupe together in the United States and brought them, in New York, and brought them to Paris. And then the other person I mentioned is Monsieur Jacques Charles, who was the manager of the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, the Champs-Élysées Theater, which is where Josephine Baker's first performance was held. So she's very nervous about this dance they're going to do called the Savage Dance, in which she's mostly naked. So She danced and sang her way through La Revue Negra to more applause than she'd ever heard in her life, all the way to the last dance, the Savage Dance, which would either make her famous or send her home to New York. Joe Alex wriggled his eyebrows suggestively, obviously looking forward to their duet. Josephine peeked around the curtain for a look at the audience packing the Rose and Gold Theater. The carved wooden chairs on the main floor were completely filled, although while Maud warbled out her blues like somebody on the brink of death, she spotted several yawns and one white-haired man completely asleep. She heard throats clearing, even muted laughter in the front rows. The boxes on the second balcony where the very rich sat were mostly empty, their occupants having left the auditorium to smoke and drink on the mezzanine behind the velvet curtains, confirming Monsieur Jacques Charles's prediction that Maud's ballads would bore them. People milled about on the first and third balconies too, but the boxes on the very top, for poorer folk, looked crammed to the gills, their inhabitants craning their necks to see as much of the stage as they could. Josephine, remembering when she and her family could afford only the cheapest seats at the Booker T, made sure to do all her dancing where those people could see it. The evening had also featured acrobats, a celebrity impersonator, a strong man spinning on his head and using his feet to twirl a merry-go-round bearing 6 flying trapeze artists, and the review, Sidney playing the sax, a solo so winsome it brought tears to Josephine's eyes, Josephine and the chorus dancing to Charleston in grass skirts, Louis Douglas in blackface and a top hat holding a flower and singing Columbine, Josephine's I Want to Yodel, her rolling her eyes and cracking her voice to make them laugh. How would they respond when she reappeared, naked and spread-eagled, on Joe Alex's shoulders? Maud's song ended to polite applause. She waddled backstage muttering and made a beeline to the dressing room where she'd hid a bottle under a pile of wigs. Who wouldn't want a slug after that dismal performance? Now La Danse de Sauvage would wake them up again. But how could she go through with it? The Lord would strike her dead on the stage. She turned to flee, but Joe Alex had come up behind and put his arm around her, leaving no room for escape. The drums began their hypnotic beat, drowning out her frantic heart's pounding. Joe, wearing little besides feathers himself, lifted her up and over his shoulders. He turned her upside down, and she draped herself over him, the back of her head resting on his chest, bare breasts facing the audience, her legs split apart. He lumbered onto the stage, carrying his captive slung across his shoulders. The breath of the gasping audience shot over her skin. She smelled heat, smoke, perfume, and underneath it all, sex. Using all her strength, she held herself in position as Joe rolled her off his shoulders and over his head, her legs wrapping his neck, her crotch now squarely in his face. In the audience, a woman screamed. Joe rolled her down and placed her on her feet, and she saw people scurrying toward the exits, fur-draped women dragging their reluctant husbands up the aisles and out the doors as the men craned their necks around for another look. Was this the riot Mrs. Caroline had so gleefully predicted? The slow, suspenseful beat of the drum summoned her back to the performance. She crouched, parting her legs. The trombone uttered a long blast, and the music erupted in frenzy. Josephine forgot then that she stood all but naked before hundreds of staring eyes, forgot her denuded scalp and the paper cap clinging tenuously to the few tendrils of hair she had left, forgot the treacherous Claude at the piano, watching her slither and slide like a charmed serpent and lusting for her, or so she might hope if he were anywhere near her thoughts. But she had forgotten all except the music. It possessed her like a seizure or a drug. It convulsed and flung her body. She succumbed to the orchestra, the drums pounding her blood, stomping her feet, swinging her arms, the slide of Sydney's saxophone like a long, sweet kiss over her skin, Claude's fingers on the keys, playing her too, more deftly than he'd ever done in bed, rolling her over, flailing her arms, oblivious, panting, laughing, dancing, free. And when it had ended, the final notes still tinkling the glass on the great chandelier illuminating the hall, she came back into herself and saw that everyone had stood, the audience bringing their hands together in a great crash of noise, cheering and shouting, raising their arms to her, their eyes shining, their mouths smiling. "Encore!" the audience members shouted, tossing flowers at her, cheers surging and resurging like a wave that builds and never crests. "Thank you," she cried and blew a kiss. "I love you all." And the wave crested again. It could carry her up to heaven, it felt like. But as she lifted her arms, the golden curtain dropped to the floor, and she found herself looking at Joe Alex, in whose sullen eyes she saw the bow they should have taken together. Approaching her, Monsieur Jacques Charles tried to look stern, although the pleasure of success softened his face. Did Josephine not see him gesturing, he asked. Had he not signaled for the curtain to fall, she might have remained out there all night, capturing accolades until the audience fainted from exhaustion. "Yes, sir," Josephine said, meaning yes, she would have, all night long.
All right. So I'm going to read from In Memory of the Girl in Green, which just came out about a week ago. It's come out in audio first, which is a weird experience. Writer friends will probably acknowledge. So hence I have my trusty paper. So of the books I've written, this is the only one that had like a moment of here's where the idea is coming from. And I saw a picture of this gravestone. It's in a place called Willoughby, Ohio. And it just says, "In memory of the girl in blue, killed by train, December 24th, 1933. Unknown but not forgotten." And the story is a girl was hit by a train in 1933, and no one knew who she was, where she came from. No one found out for 60 years. And I saw that, and it just kind of wouldn't let me go. So when I had time to kind of focus on it, I didn't write her story. I wrote something else. So this story is it's set in Helena between 1938 and 1888. So Nora Canavan is a crotchety-old woman in 1938, and she's remembering back 50 years when she found a very badly beaten girl, and then the secret that she's been carrying around for 50 years. The past is kind of caught up with her. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time. So Nora's she's from a family of Irish immigrants. There are a lot of Irish characters in this book. I actually just got back from a trip to Ireland a couple weeks ago, and there's a couple references to these Irish characters, and I'm damn well sure I'm going to inadvertently lapse into a really bad Irish accent, like the Lucky Charms leprechaun. So, if anyone here in the room is Irish, I apologize. So we'll just kind of roll with that. So this is essentially the very beginning of the book. It's a shame how quickly the weeds can take over a grave in springtime. I've lived in this part of the world all my life, and still the weeds and flowers bursting up after the cold months always catch me off guard. I suppose it shouldn't be all that surprising. After those snowy, windy, dead winter days, the green things just want to go on with the business of living, same as the rest of us. Put their faces up to the sun just like I'm doing now, the warmth baking my old bones as I kneel here with my spade. They're crawling forward, the weeds, as best they can, even as I'm doing my best to kill the poor creatures back. But still, not everyone gets a long life, and so these weeds are getting pulled. It's just the way it is. A graveyard can't just be a thing of wild anarchy, can it? So even though I'm tired and my knees ache and the sweat is cooling inside my shirt, I keep at it. I enjoy the exercise. I like to feel my lungs stretching in my chest. And really, if I finally do keel over, as I know Jonathan thinks I will, there isn't a better place to do it, is there? Just leave me here in the sun. Dig a hole and roll me into it. But of course, nothing is ever that easy. And I have a good deal of life left in me yet. It will take more than a few hours of spade work to kill me, whatever my cousin thinks. Nora, you're not as young as you once were. You can't just be getting up to whatever with no one looking out for you. He's told me again and again and again, as if I'm 1,000 years old. My actual age at present, the generous would merely call well-seasoned. My cousin thinks that I'm a frail woman, and I suppose I am in some ways, but I'm not that frail. Far from it. Not even when I was at my sickest as a girl, and I've been mostly healthy for donkey's years since. I know he thinks the way he does because his father did, but then again, his father was a fool, and we never saw eye to eye, that man and I, not ever. So Jonathan thinks I'm fragile and that I'm daft too, or going that way. A loony old woman all by her lonesome, talking to herself like she expects an answer. And I'll just say that I believe at least part of why Jonathan feels this way is because he's terrified I'll die on his watch, that in some way he'll look neglectful. He just let that poor old woman perish, all the way out there on her own, they'll say. That man, her closest relative in all the world, he let her. That's the kind of nonsense he cares about, what people think of him. He's nothing if not a politician, my young cousin, same as his father before him. Really, as such is measured, I don't even live all that far from things, just far enough. So I'm not going to sell up and go back to live in town like Jonathan keeps hinting and suggesting. There's no need. There's no call for anything like that. It took me long enough to return to this home of mine, to buy it back again when I could, and I'll not be leaving it. Or when I do, it'll be in a pine box, and that's fine by me, provided it doesn't happen before I'm entirely ready. I'm not going back into town, no matter what that man says. I've had enough of town, and of people for that matter. If my cousin wants my land so he can be the gentleman farmer he's always pictured himself being, he'll have to wait for it a bit longer. I have no interest in selling, no matter what he offers. I lost my home once, and I won't again. Not while I'm alive, and I've got life left in me yet. And like I said, it'll take more than a bit of spade work and spring sunshine to put my old bones in a hole, so you'll just have to forgive me for that, cousin. Oh, that sun, though. Have I already said that? It feels so good, I just want to bask like a lizard in it, lay out like a dry snake. It was a long winter, and spring's come none too soon. I will give Jonathan credit for coming out regularly to look in on me over the winter, to drive me into town to the mercantile to do shopping and so forth. He's tiresome, but he's diligent, my cousin, no matter what his reasons for being so may be. He's a good man in his way, even if he is a fool. He hates that I hitchhike out here to the cemetery. I hear plenty of that, rest assured, that I hitch anywhere. Although what's going to happen to me? Tell me that. Who's going to drive by some limping old lady and leave her on the road? No one is who. And never mind that this is a small town and most people know me anyway. It isn't like anyone's going to rob me or take liberties with me. I don't carry much in the way of money, and the allure of my liberties was lost years and years ago, if I ever really had any. Men have never been a part of my life, not in that way, and I've never missed their absence, I'll just tell you that. I'll be honest and say that I wouldn't have missed the absence of my cousins much either, if given the choice. But we can't pick all the people in our lives now, can we? Sometimes they just show up. The weeds are pretty well gone by now, and the grave is looking tidy again. Really, I've just been lollygagging just so I can enjoy that sun. Although I could, of course, enjoyed it just as well at home. But I like being here with her, and I needed to get out of the house anyway. I needed to get away for a bit. There's a feeling I've been having lately, a strange, out of sorts kind of thing, tapping around inside my head. Nothing my cousin needs to know about. Sometimes I can walk it off, that feeling, leave it on the path behind me until I'm back to rights again. Sometimes not. Either way, it's meditative, my grave work, and I like to keep hers as neat as I can when the weather allows. It's just spring that I have to work. In the winter, she's covered by snow, and soon enough the summer heat will bake everything brown and dry, and there won't be much in the way of weeds to worry about at all. I don't mind the job. It's calming working with your hands, letting your mind go empty and still. Jonathan thinks it's morbid that I spend so much time here. It's not like she's going anywhere, Nora, he said more than once. You don't even know her. It's not right, you hitchhiking out here to tend to a stranger's plot. It's odd, really, and it's just not right. Well, Jonathan has plenty of notions about right and wrong as regards me, but I'll expect we'll just have to differ on the exact particulars. I like to work. I believe in keeping busy. I've spent most of my adult life tending the living as a nurse down at St. Peter's until they made me leave, put me out to pasture. Now I suppose I tend the dead. I guess the habit of taking care of people is a tough one to break. Like I always do, I can't help but run my hand over the words chiseled into her headstone, weathered now after all these years. 50 of them heaped up. It's hard to believe. I remember when the carving was crisp and new, her monument funded by the town of Helena out of some misplaced sense of guilt and old Hugh Kirkendall's need to make a positive impression after what happened. something to cancel out the ugliness of that day when Hugh's fancy ceremony got ruined in a messy wet wash of red. That poor girl crushed under a brand spanking new Montana Central train engine, which easied the rest of the way into town stained with mess. Christened like a new boat splashed with French champagne. Oh, you're a horrible old woman to talk like that, you'll be saying. But it was a long time ago, and that's what happened. After all this time, I know I'm just remembering it, not the thing itself. Does that make sense? I'm just calling up a memory rubbed smooth and glassy after so much handling. I suppose it can't help but lose some bite and some weight, that remembrance, no matter how I really felt that day. So if I sound flippant, there it is. The words on the headstone are shallow now under my fingertips. In memory of the girl in green, killed by train, June 17, 1888. They didn't even know her name, just the color of her dress. It was as if she'd appeared in town like a phantom, only to be cut down. No one knew who she was, and such a pretty young girl as that, too. It seemed like that sort of thing shouldn't be able to happen in a small place like this. Oh, it wasn't for want of trying that they couldn't find out who she'd been. The sheriff at that time, whose name I can't even remember now, he posted telegrams and newspaper announcements with the description and the rest of it. Asked around for weeks, do you know this girl? Do you know her? But no one did, except for my da, of course, and he wasn't speaking. And no one ever bothered to ask me, did they? Not really. I could have told them who she was and who killed her, but no one asked me. The girl's marker was carved as it was then, Kirkendall paying for the plot, and a collection taken up in town for the rest of it. I think our town just wanted to get on with things, so that's what happened. Things have a way of just moving on, whether you want them to or not, don't they? My dad was a good man. He's long gone, of course, and he made some mistakes in his life for sure, but I don't like to speak ill of the dead. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone does things they shouldn't have. Dad was no exception. I tend his grave too. Not here, he's in the little plot we have on our land, my land again, finally. Lying there with my mother and my brother Andrew in a tiny cemetery, surrounded by a low, straggling wooden fence. I'm an old woman with the dead for friends, mostly. What's next?
Q&A.
Anybody have questions?
Is that clock accurate on the microwave? We have 12 minutes left. You think? Is it right? Yeah.
You mentioned while Josephine Baker was dancing, she was wearing a paper cap and she had very thick hair.
Oh, yeah.
What happened?
Oh, yeah, the night before, the day she was supposed to be, make her debut, which was like the big dress rehearsal, right? Anyway, she got drunk. She had Claude, the pianist I mentioned. She found out that he was going back to his wife. She was devastated. She got drunk. She went home, at 4 in.the morning, as she usually did, and she put the hair straightener on her hair, and then she passed out. So when she woke up, her scalp was burning, and she had burned off most of her hair.
Oh dear.
And she had to debut that night. She was in a panic, and there was a lot of drama. And finally, her Mrs. Caroline called Andre, who was like the best hairdresser in Paris, and Andre made this this paper cap for her, and he painted it black. And that's how her look started, with the sleek hair and the curl and everything. It was originally a paper cap that someone made for her. So
Did you have any of her diaries or any first-person accounts from her?
yeah, she has written. She wrote several autobiographies during her life. One when she was 25 years old. I mean, really, what can you? She filled it with recipes and stuff. She really hadn't much to say yet. But she also wrote. There were lots of biographies written about her too. But she also wrote an autobiography that she never finished. She died before it was finished, and so her ex-husband filled in all the gaps with interviews and with his own recollections. And so there's also that book.
And what part of your book did your reading come from?
This is the very, very first part of it.
So is the rest of the book learning about?
Yeah, so the book, sorry, I can't say this without doing this thing.
I
The
know,
book kind
I
of weaves
understand.
back and forth between
Yeah.
past and present. So Nora's past is catching up the mystery of who that girl was, and
The young man in the back there who wants the question.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't mean to keep playing. So, as your panel title implies, all of you write books where history informs the story, right? So obviously you have to do a lot of research. So I'm curious about the research process. I sort of find that there's sort of two ways that people tend to like to do it. Some people like to research everything up front and then kind of have everything at their disposal that they can kind of pull from as they're writing. And some people like to sort of imagine how they imagine the history and then afterwards research and pull the details that are going to make their imagined version have that sort of verisimilitude. So I was just curious, whoever wants to, if all of you want to weigh in or whoever wants to jump in, just kind of how do you approach that part of it?
Sure. Well, I think I'm probably more of the former than I am the latter in that case. I had already written a draft of well, not a whole draft, probably half of a draft of a novel when I went to Hanford and suddenly realized, wow, I really want to set this story in 1944 and 1945. And so I started over. And I think using the research from that particular tour, and then I started researching some books. Fortunately, I worked at a library, so I could research on their ProQuest database for different articles about Hanford, and I could check out books that are academic titles that are really expensive if I were to buy them personally. So there was a book I loved called Atomic Frontier Days. I read that. Especially the first few chapters when it was set in the time period that I wanted to set my book in. I read that a few times. And I love this website called The Voices of the Manhattan Project, which has interviews from people who were janitors at Hanford and different parts of the Manhattan Project around the United States, all the way up to like the head generals and physicists. And so I loved reading those stories, particularly interviews with women that were working at Hanford at that time. And I really loved, and I had never had this experience. I have a very quirky novel I wrote before this one that was definitely not historical. I mean, there were some moments. I think the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption makes an appearance, and I always do a little bit of research. I even researched like Sasquatch, cryptozoology, and things for it, and I love that. I've always loved research, and that's fun for me, and so I always incorporate those things a little bit. But this was the first time I really dove deep into historical writing and setting it in that time period, and thinking about what they were eating in that time period, and what they were wearing, and what the fabrics were that they were in, and what was playing on the radio at that time, and movies that were popular, all of that. And I loved letting those details dictate my imagination, like where my imagination would go. So for me, I found a lot of inspiration in the research and kind of let that help guide the story itself.
This is the most historical book that I've written, and this was pre-Google. So I had 13 biographies, autobiographies, and history books in a semicircle around me, and I did not have any preconceived notion about these things, but as I followed his journals, which my local library had his journals on microfilm, so I was able to dig into there. But as I followed, I just spun around and discovered how fictional history is. Because every one of these books related things totally different. The histories, the Battle of San Pasqual had between 9 and 21 men killed, and everyone was through the eyes of the observer. Talk about POV. The rest of them, the 2,000 grueling miles set on the one of the fascinating things that I learned about the Oregon Trail in the 2,000 miles, there are 13 graves a mile. That's a pretty astounding statistic, I think. But now we've got Google, and I write contemporary stuff too. And my last novel, I needed to see into some public buildings in Las Vegas. I popped up Google Earth, and I'm inside it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an astounding resource anymore. So.
It's great. Researching historical fiction is really exhausting. It is really exhausting because there's so much research, and not only do you have to research. I mean, this is my 6th historical fiction book, and each one. I mean, a lot of historical authors, they write like they'll stay in one era. They'll write a bunch of books about the Tudors or whatever. Each of my books has been mostly in a different era. I had two books set in ancient, Saudi Arabia during the time of when Islam was being founded, and this is like the 572 to 622, that era. And then I wrote some medieval historical novels set in the 12th and 13th centuries. So I wrote a couple of books like that. Josephine Baker's Last Dance, obviously, is a 20th century book. I thought it would be easier, than doing all that research into the medieval times, but it was not, because there's so much more we know about the early 20th century. To get any detail wrong would be, could be a disaster. So it's really exhausting, and what I do, and what LJ said about the different versions of history is so true. Like, there are so many different versions of the same history, and I think that what the writer is challenged, and what I think we try to do is we choose the version that matches our story, the story that we have, or the characters, what we think, what would this character have done based on what we know about the character, if you're writing about somebody who really lived. But I research and research and research, and usually for like a year and a half, I'm just reading everything. And then at some point, I feel like I can't wait to start writing. I get inspired, and seeing something I read just inspires me, and I have to start writing. And it's usually before I'm ready, so it slows me down. I have to continually stop and research, and even while I'm writing, I'm still researching, so it never stops.
Yeah, I'm more of a massage this story to fit the facts kind of thing. I'm a history nerd. I really enjoy it, and there's few things that drive me battier than reading lazily done historical fiction. I mean, there's already so many ways to drive a reader out of the story, a clanky sentence, or you can already screw it up. Why would you screw it up for just a blatant historical anachronism or that kind of thing? I'm fortunate that my agent is a historian, and so I can send her stuff, and usually I'm already paranoid enough that she's going to catch it, that I'm extra careful. But then it's also really fun. It's kind of a puzzle when you have the image of the story in your mind, and well, shoot, I can't do that because this is not what happened. And I'm not going to say I never decide to just I'm going to fudge the history here. But as long as you're doing it on purpose, I think it's fine. Usually I'll put a little note at the back, but it's fine to it's fun to kind of jostle what you thought the story was to fit the framework of whatever history you're writing about, and avoiding those dreadful anachronisms.
I got to tell you, you got to be careful if you're going to try to make the house payments. If you love history and you start researching, you find yourself doing a lot of reading and a lot of researching instead of writing. You have to stop, go back to work.
I was never a history buff, so I don't know. Now I guess I am, but I never was before. So it's my least favorite subject in school. Because I was going to school at the University of Montana. I was getting my degree in creative writing, my bachelor's degree, which I had always wanted to do, and I was finally able to do that. And for my honors project, I was in the honors college, and so we had to do some kind of project. So I decided to do a creative piece of some kind, and I didn't know what to do. But then September 11th happened, and I started learning about women in Islam. When we invaded Afghanistan, I learned about the way women were treated there, and I was kind of appalled that I didn't already know this. Being a feminist, I had no idea. And I started reading about women in Islam, and I discovered that the Prophet Muhammad had 12 wives and concubines, coming from a Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, or the Christian tradition, with a prophet who not only never had sex, but whose mother apparently never did either. This is fascinating to me. And so I decided to learn about these women. I'm like, who knows about these women? And so in researching the women, I discovered the one, Aisha, who is the heroine of my first two books, The Jewel of Medina and The Sword of Medina. And so that's how I got into writing historical fiction. And reading ancient Arabic history was fascinating. Reading medieval history, I fell asleep a lot. So it's really dry. So lots of heads, my head's been nodding. Yeah. So. But one of the beautiful things about writing about the history, and I think you mentioned this too, Sharma, is that like you find so many incidents or sentiments, you know. There was a big anti-immigration movement happening in England in the 13th century, right? Driving out the French, you know, or all the anti-Semitism that you encounter in throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, or the women's issues, you know, which we're still trying to, you know, get to a place of equality, and we've all been, you know, having the same struggles that just keep coming back again and again, and it just reflects the messiness of being human. And I just find that so fascinating to really realize through researching and writing about history and historical fiction how little things really ever change. It's dispiriting, but it's also really fascinating.
I want one of your stories. I'm sorry. I want one of your pieces from the medieval times.
Oh, good.
Do any of your fictional stories, or do any of them, are any of them based on personal history?
Yes. Yes, for me.
And how so is that?
Well, I write about a rape in the book, and I write about assault in the book, which happened within the rape to me personally, but the assault to someone very close to me and my family, whose husband assaulted her terribly, put her in the ER twice when he was married to her. And I fashioned an entire character off of him in the book. So for me, as historical as it was, there was also quite a few intimate details in there too. So yeah, it's also extremely fictionalized as well. So anyway, go ahead.
I've been car wrecked and plane wrecked and in jail, and you know, you bring it all out. I don't think there's any writer that doesn't call up on their own past. And,
Yeah, definitely doesn't exist in a vacuum for sure.
How long does it take you to write a book?
oh, I write one about every 4 months. I do a lot of other things too. I like to hunt and fish and cook and be with my kids and my grandkids. But this book is 130,000 words, so it took a lot longer than the book that's 60,000. You know, and it's funny, in my writing, I find as I get toward the end and I start smelling blood, I get a lot faster, you know, and I don't always know how it's going to end, but it's nice when you are able to write the end.
Sometimes I just stop when I get sick of it. Tired of his books.
She must be retired and get a retirement. She doesn't have to make any house payments.
I'm just impressed you could pay house payments.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
2 house payments. But a long time. But we've been at it a long time. We got 130 books between us. So. And thank God they're still in print. And now with the internet, anybody can be published and anybody can still be in print. The problem with the internet now is selling them. It's a lot easier to write them than it is to sell them. If you want to know the truth, you need to team up with somebody that really knows search engine optimization and how to get things done on the web.
Are we done? I thought she was signaling. That's all right. Thank you. Thank you.